Michael Reeves stood in the kitchen, methodically arranging a platter of hors d'oeuvres. His movements were precise, each canopy placed with surgical accuracy. To any observer, he appeared the picture of calm concentration, but behind his steely gray eyes, a tempest rage. 16 years of lies, deceit, and betrayal. The thought made his hand twitch, nearly causing him to drop an olive. He caught it smoothly, his reflexes honed by years in the operating room. No one would suspect the turmoil beneath his placid exterior. Not his wife. Not his children. Not the guests who would soon fill their home with laughter and congratulations. Especially not his wife. "Dad, where do you want these streamers?" Ethan's voice broke through Michael's reverie. At 15, his eldest son was lanky and awkward, all elbows and knees. Michael felt a pang in his chest as he looked at the boy. How much of himself did he see in Ethan? How much was just wishful thinking? Along the banister, "Son, your mother always likes them there." Ethan nodded and bounded off, nearly colliding with his sister Sophia as she emerged from the living room. "Careful, doofus." Sophia, 13, and already a master in the art of teenage disdain, rolled her eyes at her brother before turning to Michael. "Dad, is this okay?" She held up a homemade banner proclaiming "Happy Anniversary" in glittery letters. Michael forced a smile. "It's perfect, sweetheart. Your mother will love it." As Sophia beamed and retreated to hang the banner, 10-year-old Lucas poked his head around the corner. "Can I blow up more balloons, Dad?" Michael nodded, his throat tight. "Go ahead, buddy. Just don't make yourself dizzy." As the sounds of his children's preparations filled the house, Michael returned to his task. The facade must be perfect. Every detail in place. He'd had months to plan this moment, to ensure that when it came, there would be no escape for Olivia. The doorbell chimed, signaling the arrival of the first guests. Michael straightened his tie and plastered on a welcoming smile. Showtime. As he moved through the growing crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, Michael's ears were tuned for one particular conversation. He didn't have to wait long. "Another conference next month. I swear, Olivia's always jetting off somewhere with that handsome colleague of hers. What's his name again? Daniel. Lucky her. If I had to choose between a trauma surgeon's schedule and frequent trips to St. Louis with a dashing coworker, I know which I'd pick." Michael's jaw clenched, but his smile never faltered. He'd heard variations of this conversation for months now. But tonight, it didn't matter. Tonight, everything would change. His eyes swept the room, landing on faces that seemed unremarkable to the other guests. A balding man nervously sipping champagne. A woman with striking green eyes checking her watch. A broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard laughing too loudly at someone's joke. To the casual observer, they were random acquaintances. To Michael, they were the final pieces of his carefully constructed plan. As Olivia made her entrance, resplendent in a shimmering black dress, the crowd turned to applaud. Michael raised his glass in a toast, locking eyes with his wife across the room. For a moment, he saw a flicker of unease in her gaze. Good. Let her wonder. The night was young, and the real celebration had yet to begin. The party was in full swing. Laughter and the clink of glasses filled the air as guests mingled, sharing stories and toasting the happy couple. Michael stood near the fireplace, nursing a glass of scotch, though he had no intention of drinking. His eyes never left Olivia as she moved through the crowd, her smile dazzling, her laughter musical. It was all a lie. Every gesture, every loving glance she threw his way, every squeeze of his hand as they accepted congratulations. Michael's grip on his glass tightened. It was time. With deliberate movements, he set down his drink and picked up a serving spoon, tapping it against his glass. The clear, ringing sound cut through the chatter, drawing all eyes to him. Friends, family. Michael began, his voice steady and warm. Olivia, and I can't thank you enough for being here tonight. 16 years of marriage is no small feat, and we're blessed to have such wonderful people to share it with. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Olivia beamed at him, a perfectly rehearsed look of adoration on her face. Michael's stomach turned. "But tonight isn't just about Olivia and me," he continued. "It's about family. And what better way to celebrate family than with gifts?" He turned towards his children, who had gravitated towards their mother. "Ethan, Sophia, Lucas, come here, please." The children exchanged excited glances before making their way to Michael. He could see the curiosity in their eyes, mixed with the slight embarrassment of being the center of attention. "Now, I know it's not your birthday," Michael said, eliciting a few chuckles from the guests. "But your mother and I have a very special surprise for each of you." He reached behind the mantel, producing 3 elegantly wrapped boxes. The room fell silent as he handed one to each child. "Go ahead, open them." With varying degrees of eagerness, the children tore into their gifts. Michael watched their faces intently, cataloging every micro-expression as confusion slowly replaced excitement. Ethan was the first to speak. "Dad, what is this?" He held up a sleek, white box emblazoned with the logo of a popular DNA testing company. Sophia and Lucas were examining similar kits, brows furrowed in puzzlement. "Those," Michael said, his voice suddenly cold, "are DNA test kits. But don't worry, we won't need to use them. I've already taken care of that part." A collective gasp went through the room. Olivia took a step forward, her face pale. "Michael, what are you?" He cut her off with a raised hand. "There's more to your gifts, kids. Look in the bottom of the boxes." With trembling hands, the children reached back into their boxes. Each pulled out a photograph of a man they had never seen before. "Meet your biological fathers," Michael announced, his voice ringing in the stunned silence. "They're eager to know you. Any questions? Your mother has all the answers." Chaos erupted. Olivia screamed, a sound of pure anguish and fury. Guests began murmuring in shock, some edging towards the exits. But Michael's focus remained on his children. "No, not my children. Never my children." Ethan stumbled backwards, the DNA kit and photo falling from his hands. Sophia burst into tears, while Lucas just stood there, his young face showing confusion and hurt. "Dad," Lucas's voice was small and lost. "I don't understand." Michael felt a twinge of regret, quickly buried under the weight of his anger and betrayal. "I'm sorry, Lucas. I'm not your dad. I'm not any of your dad. Ask your mother who these men are. Ask her about her conferences with Daniel. Ask her about the lies she's been telling for 15 years. Olivia lunged forward, her carefully styled hair now in disarray. "You bastard," she shrieked. "How could you do this? How could you hurt our children like this? Our children." Michael's laugh was hollow. "That's rich, Olivia. Tell me, how long have you known? Did you ever intend to tell me? Or was I just a convenient fool to pay for everything?" The room had gone deathly quiet, all eyes ping-ponging between Michael and Olivia. The children huddled together, Sophia sobbing into Ethan's chest, while Lucas clung to his sister's hand. "Mom," Ethan's voice cracked. "Is it true?" Olivia's face crumpled. She reached for her son, but he flinched away. "Ethan, baby, I can explain." "Explain what?" Michael interrupted. "Explain how you've been lying to all of us for years. Explain how you've been seeing other men behind my back. Or explain how you let me raise 3 children, believing they were mine when you knew they weren't." He turned to the stunned crowd. "Oh, and let's not forget our special guests. You 3. Congratulations, your father's surprise." The balding man who'd been nursing his champagne all night went pale. The woman with striking green eyes gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at her shell-shocked husband. The broad-shouldered man with the beard took a step forward, his eyes locked on Sophia. "Is she?" he began, unable to finish the sentence. Michael nodded. "DNA doesn't lie, unlike some people in this room." Olivia, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly sprang into action. She lunged at Michael, her manicured nails raking across his face. "You son of a friend. How dare you? How dare you?" Guests moved to intervene, pulling Olivia away as she continued to scream and sob. Michael stood his ground, unmoved by her hysterics. He'd anticipated this reaction, had prepared for it. What he hadn't prepared for was the look in his children's eyes, the betrayal, the confusion, the hurt. For a moment, his resolve wavered. But then he remembered the nights he'd spent poring over credit card statements, the hours wasted analyzing phone records, the gut-wrenching moment when the first DNA test results came back. No, there was no going back now. As the chaos of the revelations settled into a stunned, uneasy quiet, Michael moved with purpose. He retrieved a manila envelope from his study, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed him. Olivia had collapsed onto the sofa, mascara streaking her cheeks as she alternated between sobbing and glaring daggers at her husband. "Here," he said, dropping the envelope in her lap. "Divorce papers. I won't be financing the education of children who aren't mine." Olivia's head snapped up, fresh horror dawning on her face. "Michael, please," she whispered. "We can talk about this. We can fix this. Fix this." Michael's laugh was bitter, devoid of any warmth. "There's nothing to fix, Olivia. It's over. It's been over for months. You just didn't know it." He turned to address the room, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "For those of you wondering how long I've known, the answer is 5 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. That's when I first suspected. But suspicion wasn't enough. No, I needed proof." Michael began to pace, slipping into the calm, authoritative tone he used when presenting difficult cases to his medical students. It started with little things, odd charges on credit card statements, hush phone calls, conferences that seemed to pop up with increasing frequency. But the real kicker? A chance encounter with an old friend who mentioned seeing Olivia at a restaurant in Boston. On a weekend, she was supposed to be in Chicago. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Olivia had curled and on herself. The divorce papers crumpled in her hand. "That's when I hired the private investigators. Plural. Because one wasn't enough to keep tabs on all of Olivia's activities. And let me tell you, they earned every penny." Michael's gaze swept the room, landing on each of the men he'd identified as the children's biological fathers. "You gentlemen might want to check your bank accounts. You've got some back child support too." The balding man sputtered, his wife glaring at him with murderous intent. The bearded man had sunk into a chair, head in his hands. The third man, standing with the green-eyed woman, looked ready to bolt for the door. "As for the DNA tests," Michael continued, "those were trickier. Amazing what you can do with a few stray hairs and some discreet lab work. I had to be sure, you see, sure beyond any shadow of a doubt. Because I knew that when this moment came, Olivia would deny everything. She'd lie, like she's been lying for years." He turned back to his wife, who had risen from the sofa, divorce papers clutched to her chest like a shield. "Go ahead, Olivia. Tell them I'm lying. Tell our guests, tell our children, that this is all some elaborate hoax." Olivia opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking an ally, finding none. "That's what I thought," Michael said softly. He moved towards the door, pausing to address the 3 shell-shocked children huddled together near the fireplace. "Ethan, Sophia, Lucas, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve this. None of this is your fault. I hope one day you'll understand why I had to do this." As he reached for the doorknob, Olivia finally found her voice. "Michael, wait." She stumbled towards him, reaching out. "Please, we can work this out. Think of the children." Michael's hand froze on the door. For a moment, it seemed he might turn back. But then his shoulders straightened, and he spoke without looking at her. "I have thought of the children, Olivia. I've thought of nothing else for months, and I've realized something. The best thing I can do for them is to show them that actions have consequences. That lies, no matter how long they've been told, eventually come to light. He opened the door, cool night air rushing in. "Goodbye, Olivia. I'm sure your lawyer will be in touch with mine." With that, Michael Reeves walked out of the house he called home for 16 years. Behind him, he left a scene of utter devastation. A family shattered, illusions decimated. As he climbed into his car, preloaded with essential belongings, Michael allowed himself one moment of doubt, one instant to question if he'd done the right thing. But as he started the engine and pulled away from the curb, he pushed the doubt aside. The truth was out, the lies were exposed. And while the pain was immense now, he told himself it was necessary. A clean break, a cauterized wound, it would heal eventually. It had to. In the rearview mirror, he could see Olivia framed in the doorway, her figure growing smaller as he drove away. For a fleeting second, he remembered the young woman he'd fallen in love with, the dreams they'd shared, the life they'd built. But that life had been a mirage, a beautiful, intricate lie. And now, as Michael Reeves drove into an uncertain future, he clung to the one thing he knew was real: the truth. No matter how ugly, no matter how painful, it was all he had left. The morning after Michael Reeves' explosive revelation dawned cold and gray, much like the mood that had settled over the city. While most residents were just beginning to stir, the story of the Reeves family's implosion was already racing through news outlets like wildfire. Ethan Reeves, 15 and suddenly anchorless, stared at the TV in disbelief. His own face, a school photo from last year, stared back at him from the screen. The ticker at the bottom read, "Prominent surgeon exposes wife's affairs, DNA bombshell at anniversary party." He changed the channel, another news station. Same story, again and again, until he gave up and turned off the TV, letting the remote fall from his numb fingers. In the kitchen, he could hear Sophia's muffled sobs and Lucas' confused questions, their mother's voice hoarse from a night of crying and shouting. They tried to offer comfort that rang hollow even to Ethan's ears. A pounding at the door made them all jump. Ethan peered through the peephole to see a sea of cameras and microphones, vultures descending on their misery for the next sensational headline. "Go away," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Leave us alone." But the reporters didn't leave. They camped out on the lawn in the street, a constant reminder that their private pain was now public spectacle. Across town, in a sterile hospital boardroom, Michael Reeves sat ramrod straight, facing a panel of his peers. The chief of surgery, Dr. Eleanor Patel, a woman he'd considered a friend and mentor, now regarded him with a mix of disappointment and concern. "Michael," she began, her voice carefully neutral, "you understand why we've called this meeting." Michael nodded once, his face a mask of professional detachment. "My personal life has become a liability to the hospital's reputation." Dr. Patel sighed. "It's not just that, Michael. Your actions, the public nature of your disclosure, it raises questions about your judgment, your ability to handle sensitive situations. With all due respect," Michael's voice was cold, "my judgment in the operating room has never been in question. My personal life is no longer personal." Dr. Patel cut in. "Like it or not, you've made it public in the most spectacular way possible. We've already had patients requesting to change surgeons. Your colleagues are concerned about working with you. The board is worried about potential lawsuits." Michael's jaw clenched. He'd anticipated professional fallout, but the reality of it still stung. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" "We're not firing you," Dr. Patel said quickly. "Your surgical record speaks for itself. But we are placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. Take some time, Michael. Deal with your personal issues. When things have calmed down, we'll reassess." As Michael left the boardroom, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some sympathetic, others judging, all watching to see how the great Dr. Reeves would handle this fall from grace. Meanwhile, across the city at Olivia's law firm, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. Olivia sat in the conference room, her usually impeccable appearance in disarray. Her managing partner, Richard, paced in front of her, his face a storm cloud of fury and disappointment. "Do you have any idea," he growled, "how much damage control we're going to have to do? We represent some of the most conservative clients in the state, Olivia. They're not going to want a person of questionable integrity." Olivia supplied bitterly, "Richard, I wasn't going to say that, but you were thinking it." Patricia, a shark-like woman, was saying, "We make you the victim, Olivia. A woman trapped in a loveless marriage, emotionally overwhelmed by a controlling husband who was more married to his job than to you." Olivia protested weakly, "That's not true." Patricia waved a hand dismissively, a cry for attention from a desperate woman. "And as for the DNA tests, well, that's where the medical malpractice comes in." "Malpractice?" Olivia's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "Think about it," Patricia urged. "A respected surgeon, suddenly acting erratically, making wild accusations, conducting unauthorized DNA tests. Who's to say he hasn't made mistakes in the operating room as well? We'll demand an investigation into all his recent surgeries." Olivia felt sick. This was wrong. So wrong. But as she opened her mouth to protest, she thought of her children, of the mountain of debt she now faced alone, of the whispers and stares that followed her everywhere. "Do it," she said quietly. "Whatever it takes." Across town, Michael Reeves was facing a battle of his own. He sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded by recording equipment. Across from him, a nervous-looking man fidgeted in his chair. "You understand what I'm asking you to do?" Michael's voice was calm, almost soothing. The man nodded jerkily. "Yeah, but man, if Olivia finds out, she won't." Michael assured him, "Not if you do exactly as we discussed. Just tell the truth, Gary. That's all I'm asking." Gary, one of Olivia's former associates, swallowed hard. "And you swear this won't come back on me?" "My wife, my kids, you have my word," Michael said solemnly. "Your identity will be protected. I just need your testimony to counter Olivia's lies." With a shaky sigh, Gary nodded. "Okay, let's do this." As Gary began to speak, detailing his affair with Olivia, the time she lied to Michael, the things she'd said about her marriage, Michael felt a grim satisfaction. One by one, Olivia's associates were turning against her, choosing self-preservation over loyalty to a woman who'd shown none herself. But even as he collected his evidence, built his case, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something essential, something he might never get back. That feeling intensified later that week when he received a call from his lawyer. "Michael, we've got a problem." The lawyer's voice was tense. "Olivia's filed a malpractice suit against you. She's claiming your personal issues affected your work. There's going to be an investigation into your recent surgeries." Michael's blood ran cold. His work was sacred, the one thing he'd always been able to count on. To lose himself in when everything else was falling apart. "That's ridiculous," he spat. "My personal life has never affected my performance in the operating room." "I believe you," his lawyer soothed, "but we need to take this seriously. If even one patient comes forward with complications," Michael's mind raced. Every surgery, every procedure of the past year flashed before his eyes. Had he made any mistakes? Overlooked anything in his distraction? No. He was certain, but certainty might not be enough. As he hung up the phone, a new text message appeared. From Ethan. "Leave us alone. We don't want to talk to you." The words were like a knife to Michael's heart. He'd known this was a possibility, had even prepared for it. But the reality was far more painful than he'd imagined. With trembling fingers, he typed back, "I understand. I'm here if you change your mind." The reply came almost instantly. "We won't." Michael set the phone down, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He'd known there would be casualties in this war. He just hadn't realized how much it would hurt to see them fall. Meanwhile, in the sterile hallways of St. Mary's Hospital, a different kind of tension was brewing. Nurse Sarah Chun hurried through the corridors, her mind racing. She'd seen something something she wasn't supposed to see. Dr. Olivia Reeves and that researcher, Dr. Daniel Foster, in the pharmacy after hours. The way they jumped apart when she entered. The guilty looks on their faces. And then there were the discrepancies in the research funding reports she'd been asked to file, small amounts here and there. Nothing too obvious. But Sarah had always had a head for numbers, and something wasn't adding up. She dismissed it at first. Surely she was mistaken. Dr. Reeves was respected, admired. Dr. Foster was on the verge of a breakthrough in his research. But now, with all the scandals surrounding the Reeves family, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something bigger, something dangerous. As she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with Dr. Foster himself. He steadied her with a hand on her arm, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Careful there, Sarah," he said smoothly. "Wouldn't want any accidents, would we?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine at his words. As Dr. Foster walked away, she made a decision. She needed to talk to someone who would understand the implications of what she'd seen. She needed to talk to Dr. Michael Reeves. Michael Reeves stood in the operating room, his hand steady as he made the first incision. This was where he belonged, where everything made sense, where he could lose himself in the intricate dance of scalpel and suture, life and death balanced on the edge of his blade. But even here, in his sanctuary, the outside world intruded. He could feel the eyes of the surgical team on him, watching for any sign of distraction. Any hint that the scandal engulfing his personal life might affect his performance. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Every move was precise, every cut exact. This patient, a high-profile businessman with a tricky aortic aneurysm, had specifically requested Michael despite the controversy. He wouldn't let him down. Hours ticked by. The surgery was complex, pushing even Michael's considerable skills to the limit. But finally, mercifully, it was done. The aneurysm repaired. The patient stable. Michael stepped back, allowing himself a moment of relief. He'd done it. Despite everything, he was still the surgeon he'd always been. But as he turned to leave the operating room, a commotion erupted. Alarms blared. The patient's vitals plummeted. "He's coding," a nurse shouted. Michael spun around, racing back to the table. His mind whirled. What had he missed? What had gone wrong? For the next 30 minutes, Michael fought with everything he had. Every trick, every technique, every ounce of his considerable skill and experience. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Time of death was called at 7:42 p.m. Michael stood there, staring at the lifeless body of his patient, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him. He'd lost patients before. It was an unavoidable part of the job. But never like this. Never when so much was at stake. As he mechanically went through the motions of cleaning up, Michael's mind raced. He'd done everything right. He was sure of it. So what had happened? It wasn't until later, as he sat slumped in his office, that the full implications hit him. This wasn't just a tragic outcome. This was ammunition for Olivia, for the hospital board, for everyone who'd been looking for proof that his personal drama had affected his work. A knock at the door jolted him from his dark thoughts. He looked up to see a petite Asian woman in scrubs, standing nervously in the doorway. "Dr. Reeves," she said hesitantly. "I'm Sarah Chun. I'm a nurse in the research wing. I need to talk to you. It's important." Michael waved her in, too exhausted to even be curious. But as Sarah began to speak, detailing what she'd seen and heard over the past few months, Michael felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Across town, in a sleek high-rise apartment, Olivia Reeves paced nervously. She'd just gotten off the phone with her lawyer, who'd informed her of the death of Michael's patient. It was exactly the kind of ammunition they needed to bolster their malpractice case. So why did she feel so sick? A key turned in the lock, and Daniel stepped in. He looked haggard, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a haunted expression. "It's done," he said quietly. "Olivia, this is wrong. That man died. We're responsible. We had no choice. Olivia hissed, her eyes wild with a mixture of fear and desperation. Michael was going to destroy us. Destroy everything we've worked for. This was the only way to discredit him. To make sure he can't ruin our lives completely. Daniel ran a hand through his disheveled hair. But at what cost, Olivia? We're talking about a man's life. About tampering with medication. About murder. Olivia flinched at the word but quickly steeled herself. It wasn't murder. It was an unfortunate complication. These things happen in surgery all the time. Do they? Daniel's voice was bitter. Or is that just what we're going to tell ourselves so we can sleep at night? Olivia moved to the bar, pouring herself a generous glass of scotch with shaking hands. We can't afford to have second thoughts now, Daniel. We're in this together. If I go down, you go down with me. Remember that. Daniel nodded slowly, the fight seeming to drain out of him. What's our next move? Olivia took a long sip of her drink, grimacing at the burn. We need to secure our finances. The ethics investigation at the hospital is going to freeze our assets soon. We need to move what we can before that happens. And the embezzled research funds? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll have to use them, Olivia said firmly. It's not ideal, but we don't have a choice. Once this blows over, we can repay it somehow. As they began to discuss the logistics of moving money around, neither of them noticed a small blinking light on Daniel's phone. Forgotten on the coffee table, the voice recorder app silently captured every damning word. Meanwhile, back in his sparsely furnished apartment, Michael Reeves sat across from nurse Sarah Chun, his mind reeling from the information she just shared. You're absolutely certain about what you saw? He asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Yes, Dr. Reeves. I've been keeping track of the discrepancies in the research funding for months. And then, when I saw Dr. Olivia and Dr. Foster in the pharmacy after hours, I knew something wasn't right. Michael leaned back, closing his eyes as he processed this new information. Embezzlement. It was almost laughable. After everything Olivia had done, she was now stealing from the hospital too. But then a cold realization washed over him. If Olivia was desperate enough to embezzle funds, what else might she be capable of? His eyes snapped open. The patient, he said suddenly, the one who died on my table. Could they have? He couldn't bring himself to finish the thought, but Sarah seemed to understand. Her eyes widened in horror. I don't know, she stammered. But now that you mention it, I did see Dr. Foster near the medication storage earlier today. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Michael felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Had Olivia really gone that far? Had she actually tampered with a patient's medication just to discredit him? As the implications sank in, Michael realized he was facing a moral dilemma unlike any he'd encountered before. If he exposed Olivia's crimes, it would devastate the children even further. They'd already lost their faith in their mother. Learning that she was a thief and potentially a murderer might destroy them completely. But if he stayed silent, who knew how many more people might be hurt, how many more lives might be put at risk? Michael stood abruptly, startling Sarah. Thank you for coming to me with this, Nurse Chun. I know it couldn't have been easy. Sarah rose as well, looking uncertain. What are you going to do, Dr. Reeves? Michael's face was grim as he replied. What I have to. The truth has to come out, no matter the cost. As Sarah left, Michael sank back into his chair, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. He'd started this war to expose Olivia's lies, but he'd never imagined it would go this far. The price of truth, it seemed, was higher than he'd ever anticipated. With a heavy heart, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd hoped he'd never have to use. This is Dr. Michael Reeves, he said when the line connected. I need to report a case of suspected embezzlement and medical malpractice and possible homicide. I'll share more details in person with evidence and a witness. As he began to detail what he knew, Michael couldn't help but think of his children, of the pain this would cause them. But he also thought of the Hippocratic oath he'd taken, of his duty to protect his patients. Sometimes, he realized, being a good father meant making impossible choices, and sometimes the truth came at a terrible price. But it was a price he had to pay for his integrity, for justice, and for the safety of future patients who might fall victim to Olivia's desperate schemes. As Michael hung up the phone, he felt a strange mix of dread and relief. The die was cast. There was no going back now. The war he'd started had escalated beyond anything he'd imagined. But as he stared out the window at the city lights, Michael Reeves steeled himself for the battles yet to come. The truth would out, and he would see it through no matter the cost. The sterile corridors of St. Mary's Hospital had never felt so oppressive to Michael Reeves. As he strode towards the boardroom, flanked by Nurse Sarah Chun and his lawyer, he could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him. Whispers followed in his wake, a mixture of curiosity and judgment. This was it, the moment of truth. Everything he'd endured, every sleepless night and agonizing day, had led to this. The boardroom door loomed before him, an imposing barrier between truth and lies. Michael took a deep breath, steadying himself. He glanced at Sarah, saw the determination in her eyes, and nodded. Together, they pushed open the door. The hospital board sat in grim silence, their faces a mix of concern and skepticism. Dr. Eleanor Patel, the chief of surgery who had placed Michael on administrative leave, sat at the head of the table. Her eyes narrowed as Michael entered. "Dr. Reeves," she began, her voice carefully neutral, "you requested this meeting to present evidence, I believe." Michael nodded, his face a mask of professional detachment. "Yes, Dr. Patel. Evidence that I believe will not only clear my name, but expose a far more insidious threat to this hospital and its patients." He gestured to Sarah, who stepped forward, clutching a thick folder to her chest. "This is Nurse Sarah Chun. She has been instrumental in uncovering the truth." For the next hour, Michael and Sarah laid out their case, bank statements showing mysterious transfers, pharmacy logs with discrepancies, witness accounts of suspicious behavior, and finally, the damning recording of Olivia and Daniel discussing their embezzlement and the patient's death. As the evidence mounted, the board's expression shifted from skepticism to shock, and finally to anger. Dr. Patel's face had turned ashen. This is beyond anything we could have imagined," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Reeves, I owe you an apology." "We all do." Michael shook his head. "No apologies necessary, Dr. Patel. You did what you thought was right based on the information you had. What matters now is what we do next." Dr. Patel straightened, her jaw set with determination. "We launch a full-scale investigation immediately. All of Dr. Olivia Reeves and Dr. Foster's assets will be frozen pending the outcome. Their medical licenses will be suspended." She turned to Michael, her eyes filled with a mixture of respect and regret. "As for you, Dr. Reeves, consider your administrative leave terminated. You're cleared to return to work immediately." A wave of relief washed over Michael, but it was short-lived. As the board began discussing next steps, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ethan. "We know the truth. About everything. We need to talk." Michael's heart clenched. His children. In all of this, he'd almost forgotten the most important part of the equation. The ones who stood to lose the most. As he left the boardroom, his professional victory felt hollow in the face of the personal reckoning that awaited him. Across town, in a small cafe far from their usual haunts, Ethan, Sophia, and Lucas Reeves huddled around a table. Their faces were pale, eyes red-rimmed from crying and lack of sleep. "I can't believe Mom would do something like that," Sophia whispered, her voice cracking. "Stealing? Maybe even killing someone." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I can't believe any of this. Dad, Mom, those other men, our whole life has been a lie." Lucas, only 10 and struggling to understand the complexities of the situation, looked up at his siblings with wide, frightened eyes. "What's going to happen to us now?" Before Ethan could answer, the cafe door opened and 3 men walked in. The children recognized them immediately from the photos Michael had given them at that fateful anniversary party, their biological fathers. The men approached cautiously, their faces a mix of nervousness and hope. Ethan, the tallest of the three, spoke first, his voice gentle. I'm your father, your biological father. I'm James. Ethan stared at him, a storm of emotions raging in his eyes. Why now? He finally managed to ask. James sighed. I didn't know, not until your dad, until Michael told me. If I had known, you would have. Sophia interrupted, her voice sharp. Swooped in and played dad. We already had a father. We thought we did, anyway. The shortest of the men, a kindly-looking fellow with round glasses, stepped forward. Sophia, sweetheart, we're not here to replace anyone. We wanted to meet you, to let you know that if you need anything, we're here for you. Lucas, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. Did you love our mom? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The third man, Lucas's biological father, knelt down to the boy's eye level. It's complicated, buddy, he said softly. But what's not complicated is this. You three are incredible kids, and while we might not have been there for you before, we want to be here for you now, if you'll let us. The children exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Ethan nodded. We'll think about it, he said. But right now, we need to go see our dad, our real dad. As the children left the cafe, leaving their biological fathers behind, they felt a strange mix of emotions. The world as they knew it had been shattered. But from the fragments, something new was beginning to take shape. Something uncertain and scary, but also filled with possibility. Meanwhile, in his modest apartment, Michael Reeves sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the phone in his hand. The text from Ethan felt like both a lifeline and an anchor, pulling him towards a future he both longed for and feared. With a deep breath, he typed out a reply. I'm ready when you are. I love you all. As he hit send, Michael realized that despite his vindication, despite the turning of tables, he was facing the most daunting challenge yet, rebuilding a relationship with the children he'd raised, loved, and then, in pursuit of truth, nearly lost. The reckoning wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The law office of Patricia Goldstein was a monument to power and prestige, all gleaming marble and polished mahogany. But today, it felt more like a bunker to Olivia Reeves as she paced a plush carpet, her designer heels clicking a frantic rhythm. This wasn't supposed to happen, she muttered, running her hands through her disheveled hair. We had a plan. We had leverage. Daniel Foster sat slumped in an armchair. It's over, Olivia, he said, his voice hollow. They know everything. The embezzlement of the patient. Olivia whirled on him, her eyes flashing. Don't say it. Don't you dare say it out loud. Patricia, watching the exchange with growing concern, cleared her throat. I think we need to consider our options here. The evidence against you both is substantial. A knock at the door interrupted them. Patricia's assistant poked her head in, her face pale. Ms. Goldstein, Dr. Michael Reeves is here. He says he needs to speak with Dr. Olivia and Dr. Foster immediately. Olivia and Daniel exchanged panicked glances. Patricia nodded. Send him in. Michael entered the room, his face a mask of cold determination. He'd shed the uncertainty and pain of the past months, replaced by a steely resolve. Olivia, Daniel, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I think it's time we had a talk. Olivia straightened, summoning the last vestiges of her defiance. Come to gloat, Michael, to see your handiwork up close. Michael's laugh was bitter. Gloat? Is that what you think this is about? Do you have any idea what you've done? To me, to our children, to that poor patient and his family. Daniel stood, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and desperation. We can still fight this, Michael. We know things about you, things that could ruin you just as thoroughly as we've been ruined. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Michael smiled, a cold, humiliating expression that sent chills down Olivia's spine. "You mean my past indiscretions? The malpractice suit I filed 5 years ago? The drinking problem I had in med school?" Michael's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Go ahead. Tell them. Tell the world. I've already disclosed everything to the medical board and the district attorney's office." Olivia felt the last of her hope drain away. "You what?" Michael's eyes bored into hers. "Unlike you, Olivia, I've learned that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. I've aired all my dirty laundry." "Have you?" He turned to Daniel, who had gone pale. "What about you, Dr. Foster? Any skeletons in your closet you'd like to share? Now's your chance." Daniel's eyes darted between Michael and Olivia, panic rising in his throat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. You were supposed to be in control. Michael continued, his voice taking on an almost pitying tone. "I'm here to offer you both a choice. One last chance to do the right thing." He pulled out a folder, placing it on Patricia's desk. Inside is a full confession. All the details of your embezzlement scheme, the tampered medication, everything. Sign it, and I'll recommend leniency to the DA. Refuse, and I promise you, I will use every resource at my disposal to ensure you face the maximum penalties for your crimes. Olivia lunged forward, her hand raised as if to strike Michael. "You mean you have proof against us? After everything they'd been through, everything they'd built," she exclaimed. "We." Michael's voice cracked like a whip. "There is no we, Olivia. Not anymore. You destroyed everything the moment you decided your desires were more important than our family, than your oath as a doctor." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Choose wisely." As the door closed behind Michael, the room descended into a tense silence. Olivia and Daniel stared at each other, the weight of their decisions crushing down upon them. It was Daniel who broke first. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I can't go to prison. My career, my life. It's all over." Olivia whirled on him, her eyes wild. "Don't you dare think about turning on me, Daniel. We're in this together, remember?" But as she looked into his eyes, Olivia saw something that made her blood run cold. Calculation, self-preservation. The same instincts that had led her down this path were now turning Daniel against her. "Ms. Goldstein," Daniel said, his voice shaking, "I'd like to speak with the district attorney. I have information they might find valuable." As Daniel's words hung in the air, Olivia felt the last threads of her carefully constructed world begin to unravel. The stress, the fear, the realization of how far she'd fallen. It all came crashing down upon her at once. Her vision blurred. Her chest tightened. The last thing Olivia Reeves heard before the darkness took her was the sound of Patricia calling for an ambulance. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, their cameras flashing like strobe lights as Michael Reeves emerged into the sunlight. The verdict had been read. Justice had been served. But the victory felt hollow. Olivia and Daniel had been found guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, medical malpractice, and negligent homicide. The sentences were steep. 20 years for Olivia, 15 for Daniel, with the possibility of parole in exchange for his cooperation. As Michael made his way through the sea of microphones and shouted questions, he caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Dr. Eleanor Patel stood at the edge of the throng, her expression a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "Dr. Reeves," she called out as he approached. "A moment of your time." Michael nodded, allowing Dr. Patel to lead him away from the clamoring reporters. They found a quiet spot in a nearby park, the sounds of the city fading into the background. "I wanted to thank you," Dr. Patel began, her voice soft. "What you did, exposing the truth despite the personal cost, it was incredibly brave." Michael's laugh was bitter. "Brave? I'm not sure that's the word I'd use. Necessary, maybe, but at what cost?" Dr. Patel placed a hand on his arm, her touch comforting. "Which is why I'm here. The board has been discussing your future at St. Mary's. We'd like to offer you a new position, head of trauma surgery, at our new state-of-the-art facility in Boston. Michael blinked, taken aback. Boston. I don't know what to say, he stammered. Say you'll consider it. Dr. Patel urged. You've been through hell, Michael. Maybe a fresh start is exactly what you need. As Michael opened his mouth to respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. We heard the news. Can we meet? Michael's heart clenched. His children. In all the chaos of the trial, he'd almost forgotten the most important part of his life. I'll think about it, he told Dr. Patel. But right now, there's somewhere I need to be. An hour later, Michael found himself sitting in a small cafe, facing the 3 children he'd raised and loved for so many years. Ethan, Sophia, and Lucas looked at him with a mixture of emotions. Anger, confusion, hurt, but also a glimmer of something that might have been hope. So, Ethan began, his voice carefully neutral. It's over. Michael nodded. The legal part, yes, but I know we have a lot to work through. If you're willing, Sophia, her eyes red-rimmed but determined, spoke up. We'd been talking with each other, with our therapist, even with our biological fathers. Michael felt a pang in his chest at those words, but he forced himself to stay calm. And Lucas, the youngest, reached out and took Michael's hand. We're angry, he said softly, and hurt. But you're still our dad, the dad who taught us to ride bikes and helped us with our homework, and loved us. Tears pricked at Michael's eyes. I do love you all, more than anything in this world. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze intense. Then prove it, be honest with us, always. No more secrets, no more lies. Even if you think the truth will hurt us. Michael squeezed Lucas' hand, looking each of his children in the eye. I promise, no more lies. Ever. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, Michael told them about the job offered in Boston. To his surprise, the kids didn't immediately reject the idea. A fresh start might be good, Sophia mused. For all of us. Michael nodded, a plan forming in his mind. Before we make any decisions, there's something I need to do first. The next day, Michael found himself in the office of a trusted colleague, a financial advisor he'd known for years. Together, they drew up the paperwork for 3 separate trust funds, one for each of the children. These will be managed by a neutral third party, Michael explained as he signed the documents. To ensure that no matter what happens, you'll always be taken care of. As he left the office with trust fund documents in hand, Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the pain and trauma of the past months. But he could ensure a stable future for the children he loved, regardless of biology. The decision made, the weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Packing up their lives, saying goodbyes, and preparing for a new chapter in Boston. Michael threw himself into the preparations, grateful for the distraction from the lingering pain and guilt that still haunted him. As the day of departure approached, Michael found himself standing in the empty living room of the house he'd once shared with Olivia. Memories, both bitter and sweet, washed over him. This was where he built a life, raised a family, and this was where it all came crashing down. A knock at the door jolted him from his reverie. He opened it to find Ethan, Sophia, and Lucas standing on the porch, overnight bags at their feet. We thought, Ethan began hesitantly, maybe we could spend the last night here, as a family. Michael felt his throat tighten with emotion. I'd like that, he managed to say. I'd like that very much. As they settled in for one last night in their old home, Michael knew it was time for the conversation he'd been dreading. He gathered the children in the living room, the trust fund documents spread out on the coffee table before him. Before we leave, he began, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. There's something important we need to discuss. He explained about the trust funds, how they would work, and why he had set them up. The children listened in silence, their faces a mixture of surprise and understanding. You didn't have to do this, Sophia said softly when he finished. Michael smiled, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Yes, I did. You're my children, regardless of biology. I want to make sure you're always taken care of, no matter what. Lucas, ever the youngest and most direct, asked the question that hung in the air. Does this mean you're saying goodbye? Michael's heart clenched. No, buddy, this isn't goodbye. It's a safety net and a promise that no matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, I'll always be here for you. If you want me to be. Ethan, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. We do, he said, his voice firm. You're our dad. That hasn't changed. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, Michael told them about the job offered in Boston. To his surprise, the kids didn't immediately reject the idea. A fresh start might be good, Sophia mused. For all of us. Michael nodded, a plan forming in his mind. Before we make any decisions, there's something I need to do first. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for the airport, Michael took one last look around the house. So many memories, good and bad. But as he turned to join his children in the car, he realized that home wasn't about a place. It was about the people you loved. The drive to the airport was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the terminal, Michael felt a surge of anxiety. This was it, the point of no return. He parked the car and turned to face his children. Are you sure about this? He asked. It's not too late to change your minds. Sophia reached out, taking his hand. We're sure, Dad. We're in this together. As they walked into the airport, their luggage trailing behind them, Michael felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Sadness for what they were leaving behind, hope for what lay ahead, and a fierce, protective love for the three young people by his side. They checked in, made their way through security, and finally arrived at their gate. As they waited to board, Michael looked at each of his children in turn. Ethan, almost a man now, strong and resilient despite everything he'd been through. Sophia, her mother's beauty tempered by a kindness and empathy that was all her own. And Lucas, still so young, but with a wisdom beyond his years. I want you to know, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, that no matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, I will always be your father, and I will always, always love you. Ethan nodded, blinking back tears. Sophia leaned in for a hug. Lucas, in a rare display of public affection, threw his arms around Michael's waist. As their flight was called, Michael took a deep breath. This isn't an ending, he realized. It's a beginning. A chance to rebuild, to heal, to create something new and beautiful from the ashes of our old life. They boarded the plane, found their seats, and buckled in. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi down the runway, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt, but they would face them together. As the plane lifted off, soaring into the clear blue sky, Michael Reeves closed his eyes and said a silent prayer of thanks. For second chances, for healing, for the love of family that transcended biology and weathered even the fiercest storms. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Michael felt hope. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family, and that he realized was all that truly mattered. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.